Chapter 32, The Crisis of Authority. Beginning with the youth culture. The New Left was the youth that challenged the political system. They gained their inspiration from Marxism, the Old Left, social critics, and the Civil Rights Movement. The Students for a Democratic Society expressed their disillusionment with society and their determination to build a new politics in their Port Huron statement. The free speech movement at the University of California at Berkeley was a dispute over rights of students to engage in political activities on campus. It caused campus turmoil. For People's Park, students at Berkeley support the park and oppose the parking garage. This is one of many disputes. There were also anti-war demonstrations by the youth, expressing their opposition to the military draft. And there was avoidance of the draft as well as desertions, which lead to jail time. These demonstrations are sometimes violent, though not always. So, the youth are seeking personal fulfillment. So, part of that was the hippies, which were essentially the counterculture. They were scornful of middle-class society and were associated with drugs and sexual revolution. They had rock music, but unlike before, they had new themes like drugs, frustration, rebelliousness, political radicalism, and a harsh and angry tone, and it expressed social and political unrest. The mobilization of minorities. So the American Indians had their own grievances. They were the smallest group in the United States, and they had low income, high unemployment, low life expectancy, and limited education. So in the 1950s, we had termination, no recognition of the tribes. They were under the same laws as the whites, and they promoted assimilation. However, this did not succeed. In the 1960s, Democratic administrators tried to restore some tribal autonomy. They used war on poverty money to give to tribal organizations, and they fight for their self-determination. The American Indian movement was created to bring all Indians together to redress common wrongs. With the occupation of Wounded Knee and as well as other demonstrations, they wanted treaty recognition, and they made gains in the Supreme Court. They had new legal rights and protections, a pride in their identity, and a challenge of discrimination. There's a huge growth in the immigration of Latinos, mostly Mexican Americans. 90% of them are in cities, but that does not even include those who immigrated illegally. The new arrivals are less educated and less well prepared for high-level jobs, and they also had language barriers. There was Chicano activism, which was nationalism similar to Black Power. And Cesar Chavez created the United Farm Workers to demand recognition and better wages and benefits for the farm workers. Other groups aided them, but it was an unsuccessful boycott. The bilingualism. Non-English speakers have the right to their education in their languages, and it's difficult for them to assimilate because they are isolated from the rest of America. There was also this new idea of cultural pluralism, recognizing all ethnic and racial groups instead of assimilation. There was also affirmative action, recruiting minorities like Indians, Latinos, and Asians. And then we get into the new feminism. In 1963, the Feministique was written by Betty Friedan, and it chronicled women's frustration and unhappiness in suburbs. The National Organization for Women denounced the domestic ideal and wanted greater opportunities for women. It was focused on the workplace, and it decried legal and economic discrimination. It called for a fully equal partnership of males and females. There was a new direction in the feminist movement. They went from personal fulfillment to an assault on the male power structure. They called themselves an exploited group against oppression, developing their own culture and communities. Many male colleges open their doors to women, and the two-career family becomes the norm, and women participate in Congress and politics. There is a search for equality in professional and college athletics, and there are even women joining the space program. In 1972, we have the Equal Rights Amendment. However, it was not ratified because of the fear of traditional society disruption. Roe v. Wade was based in the constitutional right to privacy, and it allows abortion during the first trimester, and this will cause controversy for decades to come. Environmentalism in a turbulent society. The old environmentalism was on aesthetic or moral grounds. The new environmentalism focuses on ecology, which is the idea that our world is interrelated, and damaging any one element just damages all of them. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring showed the harmful effects of chemicals on the environment, particularly DDT. There's growth in ecology as a science, and environmentalism and advocate organizations and activists. They have an effect on political legislation about the environment. There's a growing awareness of pollution, the depletion of fossil fuels, and acid rain, global warming. Earth Day is created, and there are demonstrations from an everyday consciousness. That everyday consciousness about the environment becomes the national ideal. In 1970, we have the Environmental Protection Agency, which enforces anti-pollution standards. And then we have a shift. We're going to talk about Nixon, Kissinger, and the war. Nixon thought America would lose honor if it retreated from the war, his peace with honor really expanded the war in order to try to win. Henry Kissinger was Nixon's assistant for national security, and they wanted to find a solution to Vietnam. There was an all-voluntary army to go to war in Vietnam. But then we had Vietnamization, which replaces U.S. soldiers with South Koreans. However, there is still a stalemate with North Korea. Vietnam. Nixon announces American troops into Cambodia in an attempt to stop North Vietnamese attacks. There's anti-war fever. The National Guard kills and injures anti-war demonstrators at Kent State University. The Pentagon Papers revealed to the public the government dishonesty in military progress and motives for being in Vietnam. The My Lai massacre of 300 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians leads to the American people viewing the military as dehumanized and as baby killers. The North Vietnamese Easter offensive. Without the Americans, the South would have lost, and Nixon orders more bombing. Their attempts at peace fail, and then most of the destructive air raid was on the North, known as the Christmas bombing. There's a ceasefire agreement. The Americans leave, but then the communists take over the South and reunite the countries, and there's also a communist takeover in Cambodia. Nixon, Kissinger, and the world. Rather than a bipolar war of the Soviet Union and the U.S., there's a multipolar world with all the great power countries in balance. There are improved relations with China and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the first one with the Soviet Union. The Nixon Doctrine says we need to maintain stability and support of our allies, but we don't need to get involved with in their local disputes. There's a decline in helping the Third World, a contempt for the UN, and support to authoritarian regimes against rebels. So Israel is occupying new territory, and Arabs, also known as Palestinians, are causing instability in surrounding countries. So there's an Egyptian-Syrian attack of Israel, and the Israeli counteroffensive is successful, and America forces a ceasefire. There's a growing dependence of America on Arab oil, and there's an embargo by Arab governments on supporters of Israel in 1973. So, politics and economics under Nixon. So, Nixon cuts off desegregation measures and dismantles the Great Society. He attempts to change the welfare system and wants income for all Americans, but that is defeated in the Senate. And Americans felt that the balance of power shifted toward the poor or dispossessed at the expense of the middle class, and at the expense of law-abiding citizens. Baker versus Core gives equal weight to citizens' votes, and Nixon is making the court more conservative under Warren Burger. He moves further in social reform with racial equality, with Baker versus the Board of Regents, upheld but restricted affirmative equality. In the 1972 election, we have Nixon versus the Democratic opposition, George McGovern, who embodies aspects of the 1960s, and the Americans are eager to reject him. So Nixon wins a landslide victory. The American economy is on the decline because of an absence of foreign competition and access to third world raw materials. There is a soaring of inflation due to deficit spending, increasing costs of energy, and a dependence on oil. OPEC uses the oil as an economic tool and as a political weapon, so its high prices and brief embargo on Israel supporters hurts the U.S. There's also a decline in U.S. manufacturing. It's less efficient than those abroad, and there's deindustrialization. We move from a focus on industry to technology, which is knowledge-based. A pool of unemployed workers are not equipped for these positions. Nixon attempts to control the inflation by reducing spending and raising taxes and having a control of the currency. However, these did not have much success. Stagflation is rising prices and a general economic stagnation. Nixon's erratic economic programs reflect national confusion about the prospects for prosperity. Then we have what's known as the Watergate Crisis. Nixon says that any challenge to his policies equals a threat to national security. The presidents are seeking new ways to exercise power, and Nixon continued this trend. The police arrest the former president re-election committee members for breaking into some kind of office. And the defendant accords testimony. It leads to a flood of confessions and the exposure of all White House allegations. Scandals include abuses of power, cover-up of the break-in, and the question was, what did the president know, and when did he know it? Nixon tries to use executive privilege and refuses to release tapes from the White House. So Nixon's vice president resignation because of his own scandal leads to the appointment of Gerald Ford as the vice president. And because of the possibility of impeachment, Nixon resigns. And from here we move into the latter part of the 70s and the 80s.